On a summer afternoon, June 25, 1876, deep in the Montana Territory, two worlds were on a collision course. On one side, over 1,000 Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, united under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, prepared to defend their land. Their meeting would ignite a battle that would become legend, a battle where a golden-haired general, General George Armstrong Custer, a daring but overconfident commander, made his last mistake. Custer and his 7th Cavalry rode into a valley filled with thousands of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, far more than they ever expected. What followed was chaos, courage, and a slaughter that the world would never forget. What went so wrong for Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand? How did one of the U.S. Army's most celebrated officers lead his men into a fight that would cost him everything? This is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the long, bloody road that led to Custer's last stand. In this video, we will uncover the decisions, the miscalculations, and the moments of desperation that turned Custer's last stand into one of history's most legendary battles. In order to support our community grow, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's dive in. Long before the U.S. flag flew over the northern plains, the land was home to nations whose history stretched back centuries. The Lakota Sioux, along with the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, lived in balance with the rhythms of the earth. Their world was mobile and resilient. The Lakota were master horsemen, capable of moving entire villages across great distances in a single day. Their culture centered around the buffalo, which provided everything: food, shelter, tools, clothing, and sacred meaning. These nations were not primitive. They had government councils, complex oral histories, and warrior societies that upheld both bravery and restraint. They did not see war as conquest, but as defense, honor, and survival. By the mid-1800s, the United States was driven by a powerful belief, manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were divinely chosen to spread across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Wagon trains crossed the plains, railroad tracks carved through sacred hunting grounds. And with every mile of westward expansion, the tension between settlers and native nations grew. The U.S. government responded to this tension with treaties, promising native tribes land and peace in exchange for stability. But these promises were often short-lived. The Lakota had already fought one successful campaign to protect their lands. Between 1866 and 1868, a war chief named Red Cloud led a resistance against U.S. forts along the Bozeman Trail, a road that cut through the heart of Lakota hunting territory. Red Cloud's warriors ambushed supply lines, harassed outposts, and, in December 1866, orchestrated the Fetterman Massacre, killing all 81 soldiers under Captain William Fetterman. It was one of the U.S. Army's worst defeats on the plains until Little Bighorn. In 1868, the U.S. signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, closing the forts and granting the Black Hills and the surrounding territory to the Lakota in perpetuity. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, claiming to map the terrain, but the real motive? Gold. Custer's scouts discovered promising deposits, and within months the Black Hills gold rush had begun. Thousands of miners, merchants, and opportunists poured into the sacred lands of the Lakota, violating the treaty. The U.S. government, instead of enforcing its own agreement, tried to buy the Black Hills. The Lakota refused. The land was not for sale. It was sacred, the heart of their world. Tension turned to crisis. By 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an ultimatum. All native groups must return to their reservations by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. But many native bands, including those led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others, were wintering in remote camps, unaware of the order or unable to comply. The stage was set for war. Custer wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of American boldness and controversy. Born in 1839 in Ohio, he graduated last in his West Point class, but rose to fame during the Civil War as a fearless cavalry commander. He earned a reputation for recklessness and glory hunting. At just 23, he became a brigadier general, one of the youngest in the Union Army. After the war, he was demoted and sent west, where he tried to reinvent himself as an Indian fighter. Custer loved attention. He wrote for newspapers, posed for photographs, and styled himself like a romantic war hero, flowing blonde hair, buckskin jackets, flashy uniforms. But behind the image was a man prone to arrogance, disobedience, and risky decisions, and he was about to make the riskiest one of his life. In the early months of 1876, native camps across the plains began to unite. Word spread, the U.S. Army was coming. Bands from the Hunkpapa, Oglala, Brule, Miniconjou, Sans Arc, and Two Kettle Lakota joined with Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, forming a force over 7,000 strong. This wasn't just a war camp. It was a village with children, families, dancers, elders, and warriors, all gathered in one of the largest native assemblies in recorded history. At its center stood a spiritual and political leader, Sitting Bull. In the days before battle, Sitting Bull performed the sun dance, a sacred ceremony of sacrifice and vision. He fasted and danced without food or water for 3 days. At the height of his trance, he collapsed and saw a vision. I saw soldiers falling into our camp like grasshoppers from the sky. They had no ears. To the Lakota, this meant that an attack was coming and that they would win. But the soldiers would not listen. The people prepared. The U.S. Army organized a 3-pronged campaign to crush the hostile tribes. General George Crook would move north from Wyoming. Colonel John Gibbon advanced from the west with infantry. General Alfred Terry and Custer would come from the east. The plan was to surround and pin down the native village, but poor communication, rugged terrain, and a deeply underestimation of native unity would unravel everything. On June 24, 1876, Custer's scouts, many of them Crow and Arikara warriors, spotted the massive native village along the Little Bighorn River. Custer feared the warriors would scatter if he delayed. He ignored orders to wait for reinforcements and decided to attack the next day. The date was June 25, 1876, just one day before the United States would celebrate its centennial of independence. But on the banks of the Little Bighorn River, freedom and independence had a very different meaning. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples gathered there, this day would mark their greatest victory and the beginning of the end. General Alfred Terry, Custer's superior, had instructed him to wait until Terry and Gibbon's columns could trap the native forces together. But Custer, convinced the tribes would flee if not attacked immediately, ignored the plan. His men had marched 70 miles in 3 days. They were exhausted, but Custer was determined to strike before sunrise. He divided his 7th Cavalry, 600 men, into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno, with 140 men, attacked from the south. Captain Frederick Benteen, with 125 men, scout the left flank and joined later. Custer himself, with 210 men, would attempt a surprise attack from the north. It was a bold gamble, but Custer didn't know he was walking into a storm. This decision would prove catastrophic. Reno was the first to strike. Around 3 p.m., his men charged the southern end of the massive village. But what they found shocked them. Instead of a small camp, the Lakota and Cheyenne had built a sprawling encampment stretching over 3 miles, housing thousands. Reno's skirmish line was instantly overwhelmed. The warriors poured out to meet them, led by Crazy Horse and Gall, lightning fast, coordinated, and relentless. As native warriors flanked his position, Reno panicked. He ordered his men to dismount and fight on foot. Then, without warning, he called for a retreat into the nearby timber. Inside the timberline, Reno's men were surrounded. Panic spread. Ammunition was low. Horses were stampeding. Reno gave another confusing order: retreat across the river. It turned into a disaster. Many soldiers were shot as they fled. Dozens drowned in the river or were cut down on the opposite bank. By the time Reno regrouped on a bluff across the river, his battalion was broken. Over 40 men were dead or missing, and Custer was still moving forward. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen had been sent to scout the left flank. He was skeptical of Custer's strategy and moved slowly. At around 4 p.m., he received a desperate note from Custer. "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." Signed, General George Armstrong Custer. But it was already too late. Benteen eventually reached Reno's battered position on the bluff. They could hear the gunfire echoing from Custer's direction, but neither man moved to help. Custer was on his own. Custer's battalion approached the village from the north, unaware of Reno's failure and Benteen's delay. As they neared the river, native scouts spotted them. The warriors who had driven Reno back now raced to face Custer. They came in thousands. The battlefield stretched across steep ridges, coulees, and open plains. Custer tried to establish defensive lines, but they were quickly overrun. Some say Custer tried to cross the river and attack the village. Others believe he realized too late the size of the force he was facing and turned to high ground, now known as Last Stand Hill. The final assault came under the leadership of Crazy Horse and Gall. It was swift, precise, and overwhelming. The native warriors didn't fight in rigid lines like the army. They moved in small, agile groups, flanking, surrounding, and closing in. In less than an hour, Custer and all 210 men of his battalion were dead. There were no survivors. Not one man under Custer's immediate command lived to tell the story. Reno and Benteen remained on the bluffs for another 2 days. Under sporadic attack, they never attempted to reach Custer. By June 27, 1876, General Terry's column finally arrived. The battlefield was silent. They found Custer and his men's bodies stripped, scalped, and mutilated. A message from the native warriors. This was not just a battle. This was a stand. Custer's body had 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the temple. Some believe he shot himself rather than be captured. Others believe he died fighting. Either way, the legend of Custer's last stand was born. To the Lakota and Cheyenne, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was not a massacre. It was a defensive victory. They were fighting for their land, their way of life, their future. We did not go out to kill. We defended ourselves. Wooden leg, Cheyenne warrior said, but they knew the victory would not last. Sitting Bull said after the battle, "Today is a good day to die, but tomorrow they will come in greater numbers." And he was right. Back in the East, the country was stunned. On the 4th of July, as Americans celebrated the nation's centennial, they learned that Custer, their golden-haired war hero, had been slaughtered by savages. The truth was far more complex. Custer's arrogance, poor communication, and underestimation of the native forces had led to his death. But the U.S. public cried for revenge. The U.S. government responded quickly and brutally. By late 1876, thousands of soldiers flooded the plains. Native American resistance collapsed under overwhelming force and starvation. Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877 and was later killed under mysterious circumstances. Sitting Bull fled to Canada but returned and was later shot by Indian police in 1890. The Lakota were forced onto reservations. The Black Hills were taken in violation of the treaty. The victory at Little Bighorn was the last major Native American triumph on the plains. And Custer became a myth, not because he was a great leader, but because he died dramatically. The bodies were buried. The war drums fell silent. But the Battle of Little Bighorn was far from over. What happened next wasn't just history, it was myth-making. It was the reshaping of truth into legend, and the beginning of America's long and uneasy memory of its westward conquest. Custer was portrayed not as a reckless commander who defied orders, but as a martyr, a lion-hearted hero who died fighting impossible odds. Newspapers ignored his tactical failures. They didn't mention the treaty violations, gold rush, or a native resistance. Instead, they painted him as a fallen knight, betrayed by cowardly subordinates and overrun by barbaric hordes. The truth was buried, like the bodies. No one did more to shape Custer's myth than his wife, Libby Custer. After her husband's death, she dedicated the next 57 years of her life to preserving his legacy. Through speeches, books, and interviews, she transformed him into a national icon. He died as he lived, gallantly, in the face of the enemy. Libby Custer wrote, "Her writings helped immortalize the idea of Custer's last stand, even if it meant suppressing uncomfortable truths. For decades, the story of Custer's last stand was taught in schools, dramatized in movies, and sculpted into statues. But as historians and archaeologists returned to the site in the 20th century, a very different picture emerged. Custer didn't die heroically atop a hill with sabers flashing. His men were spread out trying to flee and regroup. The fighting was chaotic and fast, not a noble last stand. Most soldiers were shot in the back, running, or overwhelmed. For generations, the native side of the story was ignored or dismissed as exaggeration. But oral histories passed down through Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families told a much clearer account. They described how Custer's attack broke native protocol by striking women and children first. They remembered warriors like Crazy Horse charging without war paint, unafraid to die. They recalled the fear, rage, and unity that drove them to fight back, not for conquest, but for survival. We were fighting for our children and the graves of our ancestors. Black Elk, Oglala Lakota said, "At the heart of the conflict lay the Black Hills, the sacred homeland of the Lakota people. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had promised they would belong to the Lakota forever, but once gold was discovered, that promise was shattered." The Battle of Little Bighorn wasn't the end of Native resistance, but it was the beginning of its erasure. In defeating Custer, the tribes triggered a national thirst for vengeance. More soldiers came, more land was taken, more treaties were broken, and yet the story endured. It continues to be retold, from textbooks to cinema, from reservations to classrooms. It forces us to ask, who writes history, who gets remembered as a hero, and who gets silenced?